Are you ready? Hey, everybody.
Hey, Pop.
Hello, everybody.
People in the back.
Welcome, everybody.
Welcome to the Inner Loop.
Welcome, everybody.
Welcome to the Inner Loop.
Without further ado.
Okay, so without further ado, we're going to get started.
We should get started. We're
Yeah.
rolling. I'm rolling.
We're going to get started.
Welcome to the Inner Loop Radio. I'm Rachel Kuntz, and I'm just checking in with my friend Ethelbert Miller, DC poet and literary activist. Let's see what he's up to. So, Ethelbert, thanks for chatting with me today. Tell me, how's it going?
It's going well. I have a new book that just came out that I edited with my good friend Miho. It's a book of poetry entitled We Eclipse Into the Other Side. And so, we created this whole concept of two-ness, writing poems together. And so this is a collection that was published by Pinion Publishing Company out in Colorado. So I'm very happy about that. It's a very beautifully designed
Didn't you
book.
just have a book come out?
That would be
You were promoting a book. You're
yeah. I
just
was
churning them out.
Well, I'm not turning them out. I finished my baseball trilogy, so that was like the last time when I saw you. I had a book party there in Columbia, Maryland, and that
Yeah.
was for the baseball book. But this one is a little special because my work with Miho is completely different. I think her influence on my writing style forced me to explore new possibilities, and I think that when you collaborate with other artists, that's how you grow.
Totally. And how did you meet her? How did you guys
We
decide to do a
actually
project
met.
together?
I was working on another book of haiku, uh, and
Prolific.
and she actually met me online. I was giving a talk, and so we became very good friends. Exchanging correspondence, and then she's expert on Japanese haiku, and so she was very gracious to say, "I will look at your book of haiku and give you feedback and stuff." So she was very helpful in terms of just me getting the 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 form correct, you know. So that was
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
that was very good.
So how did you get interested in haiku?
I was always writing haiku. If I went back to when I got started writing poetry, when I was at Howard University, like in the late '60s, many of my poems were very short. So I really I really sort of was attracted to the haiku form because, that was
Mm,
where most of my poems were short poems.
right.
And it's only when I started doing like readings that I started saying, well, I better have some long poems because people would introduce me and the introduction would be longer than what I was going to be reciting. So I
Oh
started
my God.
writing, but haiku poems were always very important to me, and to learn about Japanese culture, and also the changes in haiku. Many African
Hmm.
Americans, for example, got into haiku because of Richard Wright late in his life was writing haiku, and then the other
Hmm.
more contemporary writers would be people like Sonia Sanchez. And the expert on haiku is the African American writer Lenore Moore, who lives in North Carolina.
So this is your second book of haiku then
No, this is
that
my
you've
first
put
book
out?
up. This will be my first book. It's called The Little Book of E, and it's actually delayed because it's a collection of haiku in English and Hebrew. And so what
Mm,
happens is that the Hebrew is what's holding us up because
I bet.
we have to make sure that we find a good copy editor for the Hebrew, right? So
Right.
so that's what's holding it
Nice.
up. Yeah.
Yeah, so you must be really, really busy. Like I said, last time I saw you, were promoting the last book of your baseball trilogy. You
Right.
got nominated for a Grammy and
Right.
went to the Grammys. How was
Right.
that? That's
Well,
like
that
feels like a different world, right?
Well, it's a different world, but what I told some people here, it's very important in terms of looking at this category because it's a spoken word poetry category, okay? And Ivy, who won, the award, he was the one that really lobbied for this new category to be created, and I really felt
Mm,
that he was very deserving to win this first award because he helped create it. Um,
Mhm.
but I think what it raises a question is the whole thing between spoken word and poetry, because I'm not a spoken word, a performer. And what was happening,
Mhm.
people who were spoken word were up against like Michelle Obama reading her memoir or something like that, spoken word. So they have this
Mm.
recognition by the recording industry that there are people out there who are doing, spoken word. It's a very, very important for the industry to recognize that. And I think
Right,
what
that it's like
happens,
its own genre, right?
its own genre, and what happens, is that when you are a Grammy nominee, you don't have to win. When you're a Grammy nominee, that opens a lot of doors,
Mm.
and you see people who that's one of the first thing they list in their bio that they're a Grammy nominee. For me, because I'm a writer and literary activist, that's the last thing you see in my bio. Because what happens,
Right.
I don't want to lose my identity. When
Yeah.
I went out to the Grammys, you're dealing with a city like LA that has a very large skid row, and you see this
Mm.
proximity between this juxtaposition between poverty and limousines. Okay, poverty and
Mm.
limousines. I'm going to this Grammy award ceremony, but you're in a limousine passing all these people who are homeless,
Mm.
and you really get
Yeah.
a sense of where we are politically in this country.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
It's can be stark when you're go
yeah,
to those sorts of situations. You feel like
yeah.
you're
Right.
like in this weird bubble.
Sure, and then you have to ask yourself, okay, what is my work about? Am I being honored for work that's supposed to be in sympathy with certain political causes? I don't think so if I'm on this side of the fence. So
Right.
it was very important for me to see that, but at the same time, I did enjoy the fact that I got to see many friends of mine who I don't see because they are on the West Coast, and so I
Yeah.
had like a small little reception and people came out and that was very nice.
Yeah, that is great, and I love that they're doing this spoken word category now because I feel
Right.
like that's so important for DC. It's such a huge, uh, enclave here.
Well, for everybody, I saw the change when me and my friends were going into one of the local prisons here in Maryland, and we had a literary contest for the people who were incarcerated. And, it was nice for a couple of years. But then what would happen, there were people who were there saying, hey, I do spoken word, and
Mm.
we were pretty much just judging the poems that the inmates were writing on paper. But after a while, you realize that two things. One, um, we have to open it up to spoken word, and then the other thing that we had to be sensitive to that there were a number of people who English was not their first language, so we had to make
Mhm.
sure that we had somebody that could read somebody's work in Spanish,
Right.
and that's just the whole thing. Just like with In a Loop, once you begin to do programs that involve different communities, you want to make sure that people are welcome. And I'll give you an example.
Mhm.
One of my good friends here in Washington is Naomi Ayala. Okay, I've only heard Naomi read once in Spanish, where she gave a reading in Spanish. It was a completely
Mhm.
different Naomi. Maybe anytime I'm on a
Yeah.
program with Naomi, she's reading in English. She might read a poem in Spanish, but not really give a reading, to a Spanish speaking audience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a good point. And speaking of which, you are such an advocate and active literary citizen. How do you manage that with all of your books and promoting and Grammys and all of that? You're everywhere all at once.
When you say that, I just got a note from a friend of mine, and I just got finished doing something very important, which I wanted to do for a long time. I have a TV show called The Scholars, and what I was able to do yesterday was interview Susanna Heschel. Susanna Heschel, if you're not familiar with her, is the daughter of Abraham Joshua Heschel, who is usually the rabbi that you see when you look at footage of the civil rights movement. That you see Martin Luther King and you see this rabbi. That's Abraham Heschel. He was the person very
Mm,
much responsible for King speaking out against the war in Vietnam. And within the Jewish community, he's seen as a prophet and mystic. And for me to have an opportunity to talk to Susie Heschel one on one was very, very important to me. I've known her for many, many years. When I
mhm,
did my collected poems that came out that my friend Kirsten Porter edited, there's only one quote on the back, and that quote is from Susie Heschel. you know,
mhm.
uh, and I felt that
Well,
if she's going to connect my poetry to her father, I feel very blessed. But just to interview her yesterday was something that I was really looking forward to. And then I was so excited. I was sending things out 3 o'clock in the morning. one of my friends said, "Ethelbert, don't you sleep?" you know, and,
Exactly.
and I tell you this, Rachel, on a serious note, why I push myself is because I'm in my 70s. I've lost so many friends, and maybe you have experienced this also in terms of coming through the COVID. You don't take things for granted. I'm now in my 70s, and I look back in terms of just a few months, in terms of people who are very important to me as artists: Sam Gilliam, Lou Stovall, visual artists. I mean, giants in their profession and field, and they
Mm,
passed. And when I look around, I say, well, clock is ticking on me, and both of them were working to their last days, and so I say, okay, I'm going to make sure that if I'm blessed for this decade, I finish strong. If it goes into 80s and 90s, then that's a blessing too. But I
mm,
try to speed up what I was doing, and keep in mind I'm a literary activist. So for many many years, especially when I was at Howard for 40 years, my service was to other people. My service was to the literary community. There's like this Grammy nomination is only like the second award that I've gotten for my own work. Okay.
mm,
And because I made a conscious political decision, many of my publishers of my work are like small black publishing companies. Okay.
mm.
So that's why I've never been up for any sort of award. I tell people, you want to win a Pulitzer Prize, just be published by Grey Wolf Press, Copper Canyon, or Farrar Straus. I'm serious. It's like,
Yeah.
I mean, what if you got a collection of poems on one of those companies, you at least get nominated. Okay.
Yeah.
And if you want one of these small independent companies, you better have a couple of blurs by Rita Dove and Natasha Trethewey. Enjoy Harjo.
Right.
Or else it doesn't go anywhere. And that's the politics. And I think it'll come back
Yeah.
to what I like about the inner loop is that you're providing outlets for many new voices. And
Mm,
when you move through this literary community, you really encounter the politics. You encounter the people who
definitely.
don't get the outlets. And I always tell people the writers that are the most discriminated against are any writers that's doing what you might define as experimental work.
Hmm.
They might get
Totally.
they just don't get the full support. If it's a fellowship and they need 4 votes, they get 2. You know,
Yeah.
if any. And that's one of the
Yeah.
things. Being on these panels, I just said that, well, anybody who's doing something that's groundbreaking is going to have a
Right.
hard time. You know.
Yeah, it's such a shame. I've been
Yeah.
thinking about that a lot actually. It has
Sure.
to fit into these specific
Yeah.
preordained
Right.
sort of structures, and then so people can be like, well, this is what I'm used to seeing, so this is what
Sure.
is good
Sure.
or
And you know what
good in
happened?
quotes.
When you do that, you know what happens? These panels in the past, and they still do, they'll try to balance things in terms of race, gender,
Hmm.
region. But then when you get everything together, everybody has the same taste about literature.
Right. Hmm.
The same
Yeah,
general,
totally.
so it's kind of interesting. You check all these boxes, but then
Right.
they have the same view about
Yeah, that's depressing.
literature.
But yeah, I totally related to what you were saying about COVID. I feel like it really made sort of like our mortality much more tangible for
Sure.
everyone.
Hmm.
Um, and I remember you did an episode with us, an inspiration takeover, talking about how you were keeping up with writing during that time and stuff. So
Right.
I'm wondering, like, how is writing going now that we're like kind of on the other side, and a lot of us are running around town like doing 1,000 things now that we can be out again, and you have been doing so much. So like, how do you sit down and decide like I'm going to focus on poetry right now?
Well, what happens is that I pretty much don't focus that much about on poetry. What I've been doing the most in terms of writing, I've been writing essays for the American Book Review (APR), and I'm very excited about that because
Oh, cool.
my essays are is my best writing ever. Okay, and what I'm
Your
doing
best
is
rating ever.
best writing ever. What happens is that I'm able to take a essay form, and I think you might recall this. It was Ken Burns did this documentary on Ernest Hemingway, okay?
Hmm.
And that documentary, I was watching. I was really excited by it. But then I started going back and reading Hemingway, And I always think,
Mm.
oh, the short sentences. But then I saw what Hemingway was doing with repetition, and
Mm.
I began, I began to like mark up my little books of Hemingway, and on one page he would have repeat like a one word like 9 times. I said, oh, I'm going to begin to do this in my essays, and I'm
Yeah.
also writing a different type of essay, which are sort of they're autobiographical essays. And I started this a couple of years ago when I was writing regular essays for Quincy Truth's magazine coming out of New York called Black Renaissance. And I did a
Hmm.
personal essay on Sterling Brown, Leon Damas, Lucille Clifton, June Jordan. I did about four of them, in which I drew upon my experience of knowing the people personally, sometimes quoting from
Mm.
letters that they had sent me, and then criticizing some of the work. Okay, so it was a sort of like a personal critical review. In the American Book
Right.
Review, one of the essays I did was for Martin Espada, and what I also did with people who are living, I wrote the essay, then I sent it Martin Espada. Okay. And
Mm.
then he critiqued it. And I had some things wrong in the essay. But that's something that usually you don't have the ability to write something about somebody and they're still living and have them critique it, you know. But I
Right.
knew I knew Martin, who's a very strong-willed person. I love Martin. When he said it's one of the best things written about his work, I felt I said I'm onto something,
Wow.
and
Nice.
so, I'm going to pull all these essays together. I've written about 10 of them. When I get to about 50 essays, then that will make up my third memoir. And the third
Hmm.
memoir is going to be called the Volunteer Negro. And it's a term that I used that term after I was dismissed from Howard University in 2015. But it's a term that
Mm.
brings together a lot of things in terms of during the Civil War, many free blacks decided, like Frederick Douglass's sons, I'm going to volunteer to
Hmm.
join the Union forces because I want to free my fellow people who are in bondage. And so
Hmm.
I'm using that term as a political activist, a volunteer Negro. I'm volunteering my life for this particular cause. And then the other thing is that I mentioned the fact that Frederick Douglass and his sons were baseball lovers. Yeah, because
Full
base
circle.
yeah,
Coming full
yeah,
circle.
it comes full circle. Baseball takes off. Baseball and photography really takes off during the Civil War. So
Wow.
along with Walt Whitman running around D.C., we got to deal with the fact that Frederick Douglass's son was trying to get the first base. you know,
Well, it is exciting to hear you're working on essays because I
yeah,
feel like, speaking of blending genres, like the best
hmm
essays are poetic and bring poetry into it and
yeah,
stuff. So I'm
yeah,
excited to see those.
yeah. So
So
that's
are
what I'm
you
doing.
reading anything you're reading lately that has really struck you?
Well, I mentioned five books. One because I'm always reading because I'm doing a regular radio show. And
Because
so
you're not doing enough with everything else that you do in life.
right,
You're
right.
also reading 5 books.
Well, no, I mean, what happened. I made reference to my collaboration with my friend Miho. Miho
Yeah.
read books. We read books together. I think she must read like 100 books a year, and that might be in Japanese. Okay, so
Wow.
we book books together, and that's also how before we collaborated writing poems, we were reading books together. We were reading like these novels by
Mm,
Chilean writers. So when I tell people collaboration, you want to begin in terms of how you think with another person. And so when you're reading and analyzing
mm,
books, you're getting a sense of how you're not writing together yet, but you're just reading. But I'll just mention a couple of
mm,
books, 5 books that I would highly recommend. One is a book that I read that's coming out in August. It's called August Wilson, A Life by Patty Hartigan, and it's the first full biography of the playwright August Wilson. And when people talk about my favorite writers, I always mention August Wilson. And I mentioned August Wilson because somebody will say, "Oh, Toni Morrison." I said, "Well, you're saying Toni Morrison because people really don't read plays, unless it's
mm,
Arthur Miller or Shakespeare. But I think if people were reading, Fences, reading, Piano Lesson, you really begin to see line for line, August Wilson is
mm,
brilliant. And August Wilson started
mm,
out as a poet, and you really begin to see it. So this biography
mm,
is key. I'm also getting ready to interview Camille Dungy. She has this book called Soil, and that's one of the books I have to read. Then I'm reading On the Move by Oliver Sacks. That's a memoir that was recommended to me by Miho, so I'm reading that. And then I was reading Moral Grandeur and Spiritual Audacity essays of Abraham Joshua Heschel because, as I said, I was getting ready to interview Susanna Heschel. So those are some of the books that I've been reading. I like doing a regular radio and TV show because it gets me reading outside my comfort level,
Mm-hmm.
and it gets me
Totally.
reading. Yeah, and then if I have a poet that's going to be on, like say, my radio show, then I wind up reading the poetry very critically, and then I'm
Mhm.
also selecting the poems that I want the poet to read because they're the poems that we're going to have discussions around. I don't just want somebody to say
Right.
read a poem for me. I want to be able to, after that person reads the poem, to ask very critical questions. And I know I'm
Right.
doing a good job when somebody says, "Oh, Ethelbert, that's an interesting question. I never thought about that." Then I know that I'm respecting my guests. Um, I'm respecting the
Mhm.
feel. I try to create, shows that are documents that, there might be something like, for example, you're interviewing me right now. There might be something in this interview that if somebody is a PhD or is a biographer, I only said it on your show. Okay.
Right.
And so what happens, I have to access that for that footnote on page 225. And so
Right.
that's what I've done in some of my interviews, and some of them hold up. Like I've got like maybe the only interview with Frank Marshall Davis. And Frank Marshall Davis, you might recall, was the mentor when Obama lived in Hawaii.
Mm-hmm.
Few people, go back and have an interview on Frank Marshall Davis, but that's what I've been trying to do. And we just had a program that honored A.B. Spellman here in Washington, and I felt, when he said, "Thank you, Ethelbert," like, because I'm still here, because sometimes we honor people after they passed away, but I
Right.
try to do things in my program a little different, and hopefully these documents will be helpful to future people who are here in Washington, after we're gone.
Yeah. I love how you just live and breathe literary activism. Like even when we're just hanging out and chatting and I run into you and
Right.
you have something to tell me to
Yeah,
read or
right,
do or think
right,
about.
right.
It's the best. Thank you
Well,
so much, Ethelbert.
on this note, I'll say this once again, because when I saw you and Courtney you came to my book fair, and I said this, and I just said this actually a couple days ago. You guys have created a very important organization. You guys, I like the fact that when you get together, you guys are still giggling, which is a really good sense of happiness. You being a parent
Right.
also, you have time to giggle, Um, and what happens is that, that's the joy that you want to always have. That's the joy that if I'm a young writer and I meet you or Courtney, you inspire me to be like you. You inspire me to say, okay, there is service, there is a joy in terms of running a literary series and interviewing writers, as opposed to some people that just writing, and it's that's all they do. They're not really sharing it with anybody. They don't see themselves a part
Mhm.
of a community. They don't want to build a community. And I think that what you're doing is very important. And whenever I have an opportunity to interact with you, I try to say that because sometimes you can be loved, but people never say "I love you," And so
Right.
that's very important to say.
Well, thank you. I
Well, thank
appreciate that.
you. Well, I appreciate everything that you're doing.
Awesome. Well, I hope you have a great week and that all of the things continue to work off each other.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in. We'll be back next week with another dose of writerly fun. Remember to subscribe so you can get inspired, get focused, and get lit on the Inner Loop Radio.